thank you so much for being with us, ladies and gentlemen. We are discussing the book Rehumanizing Leadership, and we have the absolute privilege from the. Am I right that you are joining us from the UK, Sudhanshu?
I certainly am, yes, from London.
Okay, and so we are an hour ahead of you, so we can tell you that an hour into the future, things still look good on this side. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Professor Sudhanshu Palsule. Do I pronounce your surname correctly?
100%. You're spot on.
Yes. And I read the book as I came across Sudhanshu, and he's a professor teaching at Duke and at various other institutions. He also wrote some other books, and it was difficult to kind of choose one of the books. I initially thought we will have a look at the social leader, but eventually we settled on this book, and I'm glad we did, Sudhanshu. So welcome. I don't know if you want to have a few introductory comments before we start the conversation, and from there we will let it organically grow.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. And first of all, thank you for the great opportunity to be with you. I do apologize for a couple of minutes of delay. I just jumped off another webinar before coming here, so I didn't get time to really practice my onboarding, as they call it these days. But delighted to be here.
Yeah.
This is a topic that is very dear to my heart, and especially with what we're going through right now as a global crisis. There's a real opportunity for all of us to start examining what it means to step back and redefine the way we lead. Politically, I don't think there's ever been a more horrible situation in the world than there is today, where we're seeing a complete absence and failure of great leadership. And that, to me, really puts the onus on business and organizations to lead, not just their own organizations, but lead in the world today, because that's what we need. So I'm delighted to be here, Frick, and thank you for the invitation, my privilege. And I really look forward to this hour with your participants. I don't know, I can't see them, so I'm hoping they're all there. I got the names on the left, which is great. I've seen all the beautiful names on the left.
Yeah.
Here, let's start.
Yeah. No. So we had about 180 registrations, but as per usual, not all of them come into the live session, but they come afterwards onto the website to look at the recording. But so the book is divided into 3 parts. And you put the chapters in there, and it made a lot of sense in doing it. And I really liked I think it was chapter 13 or so, where you put the framework in place, where you pull it all together in a very practical manner to say, how do we take this rehumanizing into the workplace and into practice? But what I would like to understand, because none of the concepts that you are using are new to the world that we live in, and especially to the audience that we have. But what is new is your position kind of on these 2 vectors. So how did you become aware of these 2 vectors? And we will get to the position of meaning into it, but that these 2 vectors are emerging in this time and makes it so such an apt thing to discuss.
Thank you, Frick. And let me begin with this very good question. Let me first give a backstory to why this book got written in the first place. My colleague, Michael, who is my co-author on the book, and he and I were running a workshop for a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. And this was an ongoing workshop, so we would literally be there twice a month for the period of a year. And it's during those times that we spent together that we began to understand that one of the biggest problems with the leadership piece that we are trying to rework in our organizations is that it has become increasingly separated from the human aspect of it. We are trying to measure everything without knowing the value of anything. You know that famous quip that comes from a long time ago, that we've got so good at efficiencies, got so good at process, we've got so good at all the wonderful things that the consultants teach us to do. But something is lost in the bargain. We are working harder and harder, but we are not being that impactful. So all these questions were going on in our mind, and so we said to ourselves, we've got to find ways of rehumanizing leadership. It just came out from nowhere. And then when I was back home, and I started we said, let's write a book on this. So day one, I wake up early in the morning and I get to my computer at 5:30 with my cup of coffee. And as we all do, I just type in the word rehumanizing leadership. And instantly it got auto-corrected to dehumanizing leadership.
And so you thought that was already done. I'm looking for something else.
Exactly, right. So that's when it dawned on me, Frick, that so many people must have searched for that phrase, that it's now just coming up routinely on Google. And it not even comes up routinely. It corrects me when I'm trying to say rehumanize. It makes it dehumanize right away. And that kind of gave me the push and the motivation to really write this book even more. Coming back to your question, we knew that we had to find a way of bringing purpose in, because I had the sense that business has lost its way in the last century. And it had begun to lose its way a long time ago, but it was really getting more and more adrift. I was aware of the fact that we were turning more and more mechanistic in the way we were doing things. I was also becoming more aware, I'm sure like you, where I was beginning to wonder whether we truly understand why we are really here. What business are we in? So working with this particular pharmaceutical company gave me an insight when we asked them the question, what business are you in? And routinely they would come up with the answers, well, to make sure that we treat our patients with the right medicine or something like that. It's only when we got them to think about this that they started coming up with a different answer, that they were in the business of preventing disease. They were in the business of health. And the more you start looking at things from a different perspective, it automatically starts making you aware of your real purpose. What are you here for? So we knew that purpose had to play a bigger role in the book. But while I started thinking about purpose and talking about purpose, I discovered that in order to really discover what purpose is, there's got to be another thing that we need to bring in, which is empathy. Because if I'm not being empathetic, I can't really talk about or even delve into what my purpose is. I've got to truly be empathetic. And that's when I began to go into some more research on this, and then stumbled upon a fact that you bring up, Frick, which is I found that when you take a look at human evolution for millions of years, purpose and empathy were game changers. It's around 70, 80,000 years ago that when we became what we now call Homo sapiens, and we began to develop a large front brain, the two biggest things that came into that brain at that time were purpose and empathy. And I think, when you take a look at where we evolved, in the very hostile environment in the African savannah, empathy became a computational requirement for the brain to be able to understand the environment, to be able to herd with the others, to be able to bond with the others. And purpose, of course, allowed us to step back and start doing things that later on became the characteristics of what it means to be human. Uh, and that really differentiated us from the other species, as it were. So not only were they very important in our survival at that time, they continued to play a dominant role right through all these 80,000 years. And today, when I look at the pandemic that is sweeping the world, where we have the opportunity to now step back and redefine what we want the future to look like, these two vectors are again going to show us the way. What's our purpose over here? And how do we demonstrate this empathy that we so badly require? So, Frick, long answer to your question. I hope you don't mind.
So these two vectors, and then you bring the concept of meaning into that. Is meaning an emergent factor of these two vectors?
Yes, you said it beautifully. Absolutely. It's an emergent factor from these two. And, we call human beings meaning makers. It's extraordinarily important to us to have meaning in everything we do. And one of the big crises of our times now, I see, is a loss of meaning. We have plenty of information, we have plenty of distractions, but we are running short on meaning. And that's why back to purpose and empathy again.
And then the obvious question is the absence of meaning. What is the consequences of that on the individual, on the organization, on society?
That's a profound question. And Frick, I'd love to get your own views on this, because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about these things yourself. In the case of an individual, from a psychology perspective, the loss of meaning for a human being is equivalent to a loss of control.
Yeah.
And when you take a look at the amount of mental health issues that we are starting to see in the world, and there's a lot in the West and a lot in the so-called developed parts of the world, where we seem to have so much. We seem to have so much choice. And yet there is so little meaning. And that is associated with not having enough control over myself and my life and my destiny, as it were. And when you take it further down, it can get amplified into feeling a sense of a lack of self-worth.
Yeah.
Please.
No, that reminds me of surely everyone has read Viktor Frankl's book, The Man's Search for Meaning. And what he says is, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it now, depression equals suffering without meaning. If you suffer, that will not create depression within you. But when you suffer towards nothing, if you don't suffer towards a purpose, then it's when you almost get burnout and you get despondent and things don't become clear, because all this effort is taking you this nowhere, the sacrifice that you're making. But when you make a sacrifice towards a purpose, it's not depleting you, it's actually energizing you.
Absolutely. And you said that beautifully, Frick, and thank you for bringing in the work of logotherapy, Viktor Frankl's work. So I think that's absolutely right. And it gives us the resources even to suffer well. At the organization or the business level, I think, you've seen magic happens when people low down in the organizational hierarchy discover meaning in their work. Magic happens. And to me, the litmus test for any organization that talks about purpose and meaning is not what the CEO says or the top team says. I walk over to the guy in the photocopying machine room, and I say to him or her, tell me something about the work that you do. And if there is meaning in that work, even if it's making photocopies for other people, you got a great organization. But typically, we don't pay attention to this and we don't provide meaning for those people. At the level of business, well, the evidence is clear as rain. Brands with purpose sell 40 times more than brands without purpose. Organizations with purpose attract more talent. You have people who are more productive, and the evidence is right there. The problem, I think, Frick, is that for too long have we endured or allowed a myth to endure that business is about making money, nothing else. And that became the sole purpose of business, to make our shareholders rich. Now, making money is part and parcel of doing business. I completely agree, but it's not that. It's how you make money. To me, that's the important part. So I think even at the organizational level, meaning becomes a great determinant, even in the act of making money.
Can I tie this back to where you started the conversation in terms of measuring everything, etc., and focusing on the measuring part? I would imagine it wasn't the intent to dehumanize by bringing that in, but it was almost an unintended consequence of that. So do you feel that the worldview of what it means to be human has shifted, and that there's a need to return to a worldview that requires the concept of rehumanizing leadership?
Absolutely. I think you just hit the nail on the head with that one. I think somewhere, and I don't want to conjecture and say where exactly it happened, but somewhere we seem to have lost our sense of balance. And as you rightly put it, the instrument of measuring is not the problem, but it's the unintended consequences of applying that to every single thing. As you say, you give a person a hammer and all he or she sees is a nail. So we start looking for nails when you have a hammer, and that's the problem, right? Because you lose the balance of things. And I think we've gone through, if I may say so, Frick, I think we've gone through three big separations in our history. The first one is a separation from nature. That at some point we lost that connection. We kind of severed that connection. It's almost as if we started imagining ourselves as being separate from our ecosystems. And that was a colossal tragedy. And it somehow happened not by design, but as an unintended consequence of industrialization. Number two, I think we lost that connection with our deepest selves. Something deep inside us that we would listen to, but we kind of lost that somewhere in the noise of development and progress. And I think the third separation was with value. We started putting a price on things, but forgot the value of it. And, a simple thing like you see kids today going to a discount store and buy a t-shirt for $1. And you can wear it for 6 months and then throw it away. That t-shirts come from another part of the world. It can't be $1. It's impossible. If you just take a look at all the costs associated with this, the environmental cost, the transportation costs, and the cost of people who are producing that t-shirt somewhere in a sweatshop. But you pay $1 for it. You don't understand its value. And I think this capitalism gone mad is a phenomenon of our times where we have truly broken some of those balances. And I think it's a time to bring back that balance.
So what you say really resonates with me. But I was very recently in a board meeting. Now, while you're speaking, I try and imagine this conversation in a board meeting. And this is about leadership that we have the conversation. Do you find in your practice and consulting to companies, do they have these conversations in a board meeting? Does it have a place there amongst the numbers?
Yes and no, Frick. Yes and no. I do get invited to speak to boards and to executive teams. Some of them embrace it right away, some don't. But here's what's happening in the meanwhile. And I think there is room for optimism. Here's what's happening. If you take climate change and social inequity as two big disruptive trends that are coming our way very quickly, and take a look at what's happening in the United States right now. It's almost like a civil war.
Yeah.
So if you take those two alone, I'm absolutely certain that in the next 2 years, we are going to see financial instruments and financial institutions starting to legislate some of these things. Right. So climate change will have a massive financial cost. There'll be repercussions to not doing things in a certain way, and that's coming. And the same will go with a few other disruptions that are coming along our way. So the point I'm trying to make is it's no longer going to be a case of is it a right thing to do or not a right thing to do? I think there's going to be a financial cost, especially with climate change coming up soon. But it's the second one that it's another point that I want to bring up that I think I'm finding more promising. I think there is a generation growing up that is going to demand some of these things of us and of our companies. Now, it may happen in slow time, but the fact is people will make choices about the products they buy, the services they buy. They'll make choices about where to go and work. This is still a long way coming, but I think there is something promising about what the younger generations are talking about today. And in the end, I think we'll have to determine whether what kind of a world do we want to leave behind for our children, our grandchildren, and their children. And that's as much as we can say to the board, Frick.
You say in your book, you describe, and you almost say, purpose is the invisible power of leadership. Why do you state it like that?
Well, you definitely read the book. In fact, you probably remember more of it than I do right now. So I was actually drawing on the work of an extraordinary woman, Marianne Follett, who, believe me, she wrote this in 1920 something. And she talked about purpose as the invisible leader in your organization. And she was writing about this in the 20s. And she was saying basically that if you have purpose in your organization, it almost becomes a leadership principle. It becomes your North Star. And you don't have to worry then about all those things. People will do the right thing. People will take the right action. People will exhibit the right behaviors when there is purpose in the organization. And that purpose is lived by by the top leaders.
Yeah.
So that's the invisible force that you likely picked up, Frick.
Yeah. So I see that you spent in one of the later chapters, you spend a whole chapter on the purpose of purpose, and I would imagine that's kind of the gist of it in what you've shared with us now. You spoke about nature and our separation from nature. You also quote Bateson on saying that's one of our biggest problems, that we have separated ourselves in thinking that we can operate apart from nature. And you make a point and say that we believe that we are separate from nature, that thoughts and emotions are two separate things, and the notion of the universe as a machine. Why is that old thinking? What is it replaced with? Purpose? Is it replaced with purpose and empathy? Well, is purpose and empathy enough to get us to a point of shedding this old thinking?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. I don't think it's enough. To answer your last question, I don't think it's enough. I don't think purpose and empathy that's not the magic bullet. No, not at all. I think what purpose and empathy do is that they allow for bigger conversations to take place. They give us the license to talk about things that really matter. And I think in talking about those things and in trying to experiment with some of those things, we will probably redress the balance that we seem to have lost. I remember I started my life as a physicist. I was trained as a physicist, and going back about 40 years now. And I still remember when we used to do physics and science, and we routinely used to linearize complex equations in physics. So a complex equation is basically a nonlinear graph, like a graph that doesn't go in a straight line. But we would routinely linearize it. So how do you linearize a nonlinear graph? By making approximations. So in a way, the 20th century was really about making a whole bunch of approximations about how things work. And one of the things that we assumed was that we can be objective about these things and we can rationalize everything. In a way, that tendency was part of a bigger tendency that human beings have carried even before then, of thinking that we can describe the world in terms of a machine. And this, to me, was one of our biggest drawbacks. It's understandable why we did it at that time. You're looking at a long time ago when clockmaking was the most sophisticated industry in the world. And in Europe, clockmaking was at its pinnacle. And so it was very important for scientists at that time to visualize the universe as a big, gigantic clock, which is what Isaac Newton called it. And of course, Newton also had to keep the clergy happy. So he had to keep both sides happy, the scientists and the clergy in the church. So he said the universe is like a gigantic clock, and if you understand the way the clock works, you understand everything. However, there is a clockmaker, and that's God. So the clergy was happy with that description. So clockmaking became the metaphor, and over time, that clockmaking metaphor led to other machines becoming the dominant metaphor of our times. Now, what happened with that, Frick, is that we lost touch with nature in its essence. We lost touch with natural rhythms, rhythms of the seasons, rhythms of the tides. And if you go back into the literature of that time, you have a lot of the poets and artists complaining that the scientists were taking away the enchantment of nature. What they were trying to say was, we are losing touch with it, folks. Don't do that. And I think that's where it all started, with that mechanistic model. I'm not asking us to go back to some kind of enchanted model. I'm just asking to become more ecological. That's it.
Yeah, and I have a sense while you were speaking now, and you spend a lot of time in the book around the whole notion of complexity. And while you were speaking now, things became a bit more clearer to me why you spent so much time. And I'm wondering, in that mechanistic view of the world that we had and still have, if that's kind of a coping mechanism from our side to make sense, because we don't have the right tools to deal with complexity, and we take that kind of mechanistic view and into science in the reductionist mode, and so we can analyze it to the parts, and then we think if we understand the parts, we may understand the whole.
Beautiful. Rick, I think you said it infinitely better than I did. And in much shorter space of time too. Fabulous. Let me just build very quickly on what you said, and I'll give it back to you. You talked about that reductionist model, right? I mean, this is something that all of you in the audience will resonate with. You remember, those of you who did science in your classes. I think all of us did a little bit of that, right? So typically, if you wanted to understand a flower, your teacher would say, let's cut that flower, bring it into the laboratory, and then you're given a microscope. If you went to a good school, you had a better microscope. I never did, but you had a microscope. And then the flower would be chopped into tiny pieces, and you would look at them under the microscope. Now, in so doing, you were able to describe one part of that flower's reality, one part of it, which means the reductionist reality that Frick talked about. So you're able to describe its parts, its phylum, its different cells, and all those things. But that's not enough. When you bring that flower into your laboratory and see it as a part, the thing that you're missing is that flower's relationship to everything else outside, including the sun. So what's happened, I think, Frick, is that we have focused so much on the reducing part of everything, including our economics and including the financial instruments, that we have lost touch with the other side of it, which is the ecosystem, the complex side. And what's happening in the 21st century is that complexity is now coming back. It's like the chickens coming home to roost again. If you take a look at this pandemic, it's the most frightening and the most amazing example of complexity. You know, if anyone wanted to understand what exponentials look like, the pandemic is providing the lessons. And that's why we got to now step back and think about how do we approach the 21st century from here onwards. That's what you've been saying.
I really like that because, I'm sorry that I'm turning back again and again to some of the things that you've said. How do we bring this back to the title of the book? What of what you've said now? What are the implications for us as leaders in this space? If we have to listen to this and reflect on this, what are the implications for us in our leadership? And referring to the title of the book, Rehumanizing, what should change in our approach, our mindset as leaders of organizations?
Thank you. I think it is about, if I ask the question to myself, to rehumanize my leadership, I must, one, rehumanize myself. I need to become a lot more self-aware about who I am and how I come across to people. I must do that because that's the real starting point for me as a leader. I must begin to rehumanize my relationships. Many of those relationships I may have from a leadership perspective may have lost that balance over the years. I may have to go back to understanding what it means to rehumanize my leadership with my teams, with my associates, with my family, with my children, with my, whatever ecosystem you think about. I then want to talk about rehumanizing my organization to help my people and my organization rediscover why we are here. What business are we really in? And then I want to take that conversation further to talking about what does it mean to rehumanize our relationship as an organization with our customers, with our clients, with the people that we serve. Because we are here to serve, not to take. We are here to serve. What does that mean? And then I want to rehumanize the way we operate in the larger society that we are a part of. I cannot keep taking. Frick, what stuns me very often is how easy this thing is to understand. I think back to the way we used to operate before. Think of a village where you had a shop, and that shop sold groceries, like a real mom and pop shop. In order for that shop to be successful in that little community, the community had to be healthy and prosperous. Because if the community weren't healthy and prosperous, they wouldn't buy from you in the first place if they didn't have the money.
Yeah.
So therefore, as a shopkeeper, it's in my interest to create a prosperous community around me. I'm beholden to do that. And it's not just because I want to be a good human being, but I also want to be a good businessman, for God's sake. And I'm where did we lose that logic? Right? And I think that logic was lost in Number one, the scale at which we operate now, the size, the numbers, the Excel spreadsheets, and just the noise that's created around the world. We just lost sight of that. And I think it's very simple why we need to put purpose back into business.
Yeah. Because you say that leaders have fell into the trap of control, power, and attention.
Yes. My God, you really read the book. I think among all three, keeping in mind that we don't have very long, I'd love to just focus on one thing that you said out of all three. I want to focus on power. And I think it's a fascinating thing that somewhere along the line in the previous century, or even before, no, much before, not just previous century, we somehow formed the idea and the assumption that power is only top down, and that the higher you go, the more power you have. And of course, why not? I mean, that's the way societies were at one time. Mm-hmm. And that came into the whole field of leadership. And we began to associate leadership with authority. That the more authority you had, the more leadership you had to have. And now what the 21st century is doing, it's turning this thing around. We are moving away from assets. You don't need to own too much. I mean, look at Uber has a valuation, the same valuation as General Motors, and it took them 6 years. And they have no assets. Well, forget about Uber. Think about the young generation, our children, the millennials, those in their 20s and 30s. They don't want to buy cars anymore. They find it ridiculous to buy cars, especially when you live in cities. Why buy a car? People are starting to question this whole asset model, the model of owning, the model of the hierarchy, the model of power coming from the top. And look at information. You see, at one time, the people at the top had a lot more information than the people at the bottom, and that gave power. No more. So when all the instruments that gave us power, hierarchical power in the 20th century are disappearing, we have to start redefining what power means in the 21st century. And from a leadership perspective, the power to inspire, the power to be purposeful, the power of kindness, the power of empathy, the power of doing good, the power of providing service. I think these are the alternative instruments of power that we need to start depending on. And by the way, you can make money with these. I'm not talking to a bunch of charitable organizations. You can make money with these. They are profitable. The only thing is we haven't seen them as that way yet.
Yeah, because I think there's a number of people in our audience that would really like to understand the link between purpose, empathy, and profits.
Yes, I'm sure they do. And so I won't name there's an FMCG organization here I work with. It's also big in South Africa. I won't name them right now, but they have data coming from the last many years that when they sell a brand which has a purpose story behind it, which means that brand either is ecologically sourced and the plastic is ecologically dispensed off and all that stuff, or they stand for something, or part of that profit goes towards funding something, whatever you think of, they find that those brands sell far more than the ones that don't have that brand associated with it. I don't, and I could go to town talking about why profit and purpose are two sides of the same coin. Yes, you can make money without purpose. It's not a logical, I'm not trying to create a logical correlation over here. You can have a company with absolutely no purpose and you can make tons of money if that's what you want to do. But if you want to run a company which has purpose at the heart of it, you can still make money. I think that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and that's kind of where you make a very logical statement in saying that purpose and empathy comes before strategy, which sounds logic. And one could almost say, yeah, maybe many times purpose happens before strategy. But I wonder to what extent empathy is consciously being positioned before strategy and before strategic conversations.
What a beautiful comment. What a beautiful comment. And I hadn't thought about it myself, Rick, so thank you for raising it right now. And I'm thinking of how much better informed your strategy would be if it was preceded by empathy. And empathy for what? Empathy for your market, empathy for your customers, empathy for what's going on outside. In my experience, when I have worked with people and talked about what it means for them as a CFO, for example, to be empathetic, and got them to understand that empathy is not just that soft, cuddly emotion that we want, but empathy is an important business imperative. They're able to pick up weak signals in their environment faster than the others.
Hmm.
So let me just take one quick example, if you don't mind. And I'm sure my friends at Nokia wouldn't mind me bringing them up, but there was a time when Nokia was at its pinnacle in terms of being the iconic company that sold mobile phones. We all had a Nokia. To the point that success that they had, I feel, made them less empathetic. Hubris, the beautiful word from English. Hubris and empathy are negatively correlated to each other. So the more hubris you develop, the less empathy you feel. And that hubris that Nokia developed, and rightly so, they just stopped picking up the weak signals in their environment. And I'll just name two weak signals. In the year 2007, Google went and bought a company called Android in Silicon Valley for a couple of $1 million. Everybody saw it happening. They saw it at Nokia, but they did not pick it up. Hubris tells you, come on, what's the big deal over here? And the other example was of Samsung increasing its expansion. And they were so stuck to their business model of producing handsets, as they call them, that they were late in picking up the early signs that were coming in, that in a couple of years from now, your phone would not be a handset, it would be a platform for experience. And the providers of the experience would not be Nokia or Samsung or anyone. They would be all these wonderful apps that go in. They just failed to see that. And to me, that is empathy. So empathy's also got a very strong business purpose to it.
Absolutely. I want to read you one of our audience members, Sharon Sinclair, says here, empathy and purpose, etc., is more powerful and sustainable as the individual is in alignment with self and business. The input is higher, thus the output is higher. It is an energy that attracts more wealth on multiple levels.
I would love to see this comment. It's beautifully worded. And interestingly, you're talking. Can you name the person so I can address
Sharon?
Yeah. Sharon, you said something profound here, and you used two words which I think need to come back into the narrative. You talk about energy; it creates energy, and the second word you use is wealth.
Yeah.
Not money. Not money at all, but wealth. And a long time ago, I was reading up on the early forefathers and foremothers. So unfortunately, they were all mainly men who were in the business of creating new businesses, and truly businesses that were aligned with the communities at that time. And they all talked about creating wealth. And I think when you talk about wealth, it has a different meaning to it, because wealth becomes something that benefits a whole bunch of other people too. It's not my bank account, it's creation of wealth. And energy and wealth, I love the way you use those two words. And yeah, absolutely beautiful statement. Thank you.
So, to avoid us running out of time, I want to switch to another section that was very interesting in the book. So you spent quite some time on the whole notion of technology and our almost coexistence with technology. So with all the development in AI and robots, this week somebody sent me a little video of the King of Bahrain appearing in Dubai at a expo with this gigantic robot who can almost annihilate the whole earth in one shot, walking behind him. And I had this fear in my heart, is this the new world awaiting us? And I want to ask you from your experience and your conversations, and I want to get to Vivian Ming maybe in a moment, but can we coexist meaningfully with technology and AI-driven robots who are becoming all the more human-like? Or is that driving us, forcing us back to purpose and to empathy?
You had to leave the most difficult question till the last. Well, yeah, let me jump on it right away. Thank you for asking that question, Frick. So let me start off by saying that one of the things we did when we wrote this book was I spent a lot of time talking to a whole bunch of neurologists and psychologists and people developing AI and robotics in the world. And one of them is mentioned in the book, an amazing woman called Vivian Ming. And when we talked to them, I think I had a very naive question that I used to raise with these people, very esteemed people. I used to say, tell me one thing that in your mind AI and robotics can never do. And that is in the purview of the human mind. And by and large, I got these two answers. They said, we don't think AI can ever develop purpose. And they also said AI can be very, very intuitive. In fact, intuition is something that they talk about all the time in AI, but not empathy. So back again to the two vectors, Frick. They've been around for a long time. They continue to be quintessentially human qualities that, from what we know so far, will not be replicated. And so I think even more reason why we got to preserve them. And then very quickly, just a minute more on the other part of the question. I don't think we're going to stop AI and robotics. Impossible. Technology has a life of its own. It's exponential. It will happen. All that we can hope for is that we come up with the leadership and the moral arc that we require to make sure that we use it for good purposes. And this is where I worry when I see the bunch of, the politicians that we have in the world today. I think there's going to come a time in the next 20 years where there'll be two types of people in the world, the augmented and the non-augmented. That's the classification we'll have. Augmented are those who carry a chip inside their body somewhere. The non-augmented are ones who don't carry the chip, and they'll be a decreasing minority as we go along. It's here to stay. I think the best that we can hope for is that we become better human beings.
Yeah. And I think that requires still a lot of reflection and thinking about how do we conduct ourselves as proper human beings in a world with this exponential technology that's happening. And I read what Vivian Ming is saying, and I thought of our audience where we have a number of people from HR and learning and development. She says, AI and machine learning is profound. It will have a profound impact on our society and on human potential. Human capital is becoming a toxic asset if we don't change the way we build people. They will be vastly less than we think they are. Those are strong words.
Yes, yes. And sometimes I do worry, Frick, when I especially when we get those WhatsApp feeds and messages, the level of toxicity we can spread about people. It's happening everywhere. We are becoming more hateful, we are becoming more divided than ever. And somehow we are seeing some of the worst use of technology. And this technology is in our hands. And forget about AI. This is like what you carry in your phones right now. So I do think, I think, what is it about us, huh? We carry the same seed, we carry the seeds of greatness and nobility, and we carry seeds of destructiveness.
Yeah.
And, reminds me of that beautiful story from the Native American, one of the Native American stories where there is a grandmother putting her grandson to sleep, and the grandson says, "Grandma, tell me a story." And she starts telling a story, and she says, "Well, let me tell you a story about two wolves who are fighting with each other. One of those wolves was kind, compassionate, gentle, noble, good. And the other wolf was everything opposite, mean, nasty, hateful. And those two wolves kept fighting with each other." And the grandson says, "Grandma, which wolf won?" And that's when she said, "Well, those two wolves are inside us all the time. And the wolf that wins is the one that we feed." It's a beautiful story.
Beautiful story, yeah.
So I think I'd love to just leave everyone with that one thought, and especially young people, our children, and other generations. Let's watch what we feed ourselves. If we feed ourselves with those things, that's what we become. And we carry both potentials in our minds, and that's really something. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think thank you so much. And I think the coexistence with technology, our purpose and our empathy must get us that technology assists us to become better human beings and not dehumanizing us, but almost rehumanizing it. One of my favorite people in leadership development is Peter Kustenbaum. And he says somewhere in his book, Leadership, the Inner Side of Greatness, he says, and I know somebody else said it, he just paraphrased it. He said, when business discovers the word love, man will discover fire for the second time.
Beautiful.
And I think that resonates very strongly with this whole notion of purpose and empathy. I thank you so much that you visited us here in South Africa with the technology, and that I truly hope that this conversation contributed to our rehumanization of leadership, and that people will reflect on the content that you've shared with us and on the content that is in much more detail in the book. We wish you best of luck on the other side of the ocean. And for the great work that you do, and keep doing it, because we enjoy the products of your labor.
Thank you, Frick. It's an honor for me to be here. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for the privilege.
Keep well, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is recorded. You will find it on our website. Wayne will in time share with you the link, and then you can have a second look on this, or you can invite somebody else to have a look at this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.